Sustainability is a youth-led national organization that aims to empower and connect young leaders to drive positive changes towards a sustainable future. So in tandem with COP27 and Saudi Green Initiative, we are so excited to invite Dr. Gaathier Mahed to give us a talk in lessons from Quran on climate change. Dr. Gaathier is the author of Climate Change, Lessons from the Quran and Sunnah. He has a passion for groundwater with a focus on understanding subsurface fluid flow. And he was awarded the Nelson Mandela University Science Faculty Excellent Teacher Award for 2018 and the Vice Chancellor's Award for the Emerging Excellent Teacher for 2020. And he also served as the Deputy Dean for the Faculty of Science at Nelson Mandela University. So welcome, Dr. Gaathier, and all the floor is yours. All the floor is yours. And please, if any one of you has any question, you are most welcome to write it down on the chat.
Before we start, I would just love to welcome Dr. Gaathier myself. I'm Iman Al-Haji, the founding president of Saudi Youth for Sustainability, and I would love to welcome everyone here. And I kindly ask Fatima to introduce herself quickly. I think you did not introduce yourself, right? Go ahead.
I'm Fatima Abdel Hakim. I'm a co-founder of Saudi Youth for Sustainability, and I'm a PhD student in bioscience here at KAUST. Thank you.
Shukran for that, Fatima. Shukran for the welcome, Iman and Fatima. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa ahlul uqdatan min lisani. Shukran for the warm welcome, colleagues. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So today's talk, as was highlighted, will obviously largely be focused on climate change, seeing that we at COP is happening at the moment. But as Muslims, and obviously in Muslim countries, largely Muslim majority countries, what are the lessons that we can learn, particularly from the Quran and Sunnah? Now, I was told that the audience might be very broad, so we're just going to set some kind of baseline in terms of what is climate change. So fundamentally, shifts in climate mean that certain or specific areas of the Earth's surface are either becoming wetter or drier over time. And we can use the Middle East as a good example, where over the past few years, particularly in Jeddah and Riyadh, we've seen multiple flash floods occurring. So increased precipitation in specific areas, or increased volumes of precipitation over shorter periods of time. But this is over a longer period. And this should not be confused with weather, which is obviously the day-to-day changes. All right. Now, obviously, this ties in very well with the concept of sustainability. If a principle or the context we find ourselves in, we need to understand that sustainability, that nexus point between your social and environmental as well as economic needs, and then determining whether something is bearable, equitable, as well as viable. So that interlinking of that is sustainability. Coupled to that, one has to be cognizant of the fact that you're not compromising the needs of your future generations, but you're still meeting the needs of the current generation. And I use the word needs because it's very important for us to understand that there's enough for everyone's need, but not necessarily everybody's greed, right? Now, in Islam, in the Quran, there's so many places where Allah speaks to us and he tells us, and here's a good one where he says, O children of Adam, wear your beautiful apparel at every time in place of prayer, eat and drink, but waste not by excess. In Arabic, kulu washrabu wa la tusrifu, right? For Allah loveth not the wasters. Inna Allah la yuhibbul musrifin. Allah doesn't love those who waste. Now, if you look at this ayat, in its context, it's about sustainable management of resources, not wasting, not throwing away, not using excess. And that in fundamentally is actually where Islam and sustainability sort of come together. There's another ayat in the Quran where Allah, he says, inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. Now, to unpack that concept of khalifa, it's quite a complex thing, but in essence, some of the ulama and the translators speak about us being caretakers, vicegerents, representatives here on earth. And if somebody is to send their representative, obviously they would want to send the best person that they can, who's going to do the job in the best manner. And that's our responsibility as mankind here on this earth. And that's where Islam, particularly in the Quran, speaks about aspects of sustainability. Now, obviously, which relates to the topic of this talk, where would one even begin to think about climate change in the Quran? If we can take a step before that, we should be asking the question, is there aspects of scientific miracles or science in the Quran? And there definitely is. There's so many books written and pamphlets and talks given by great shuyukh and scholars like Dr. Zaghlul Najjar, who's also a geologist, Dr. Zakir Naik. One of the original books on the Quran and modern science was written by Maurice Buccal, who was a French surgeon who actually worked in Saudi Arabia for one of the princes as a physician. But bringing it back home to climate change in the Quran, we start off with the story of Nabi Nuh. Now, in the Quran, we see this ayat here on the left. And obviously, Nabi Nuh had to build his ark in the desert. He was ridiculed. People laughed at him. They mocked him. They didn't understand why he was doing what he was doing. But Allah gave him an order, and sami'ana wa ata'na, right? But in the analysis of these ayah, and you can see where Allah speaks, when our commandment came to pass and the oven gushed forth water. There's two classical analyses of the ayah by Mufassirin, one by Ibn Kathir and a more contemporary one by Sayyid Qutb. And they both speak about this oven gushing forth water, which means that even from places where there was normally fire, water would come forth. Now, fire and water obviously completely opposite, right? So that means the volumes of water that were being pushed forth, which means it was completely flooded everywhere in every concept. A slightly more modern interpretation of an oven gushing forth water could be seen as maybe a spring or a groundwater spring or a ain, where there's water coming forward and it's just running all the time. And there's a lot of arguments around this, specifically, these ayat and whether the whole world was flooded at the time, whether only a part of it was flooded. But at the end of the day, there was a flood, and it was a catastrophic event that wiped away a large part of the population, right? Now, I like to pause here and think for ourselves, in the context you find yourselves in Saudi Arabia, in the middle of the desert. You have to think, what is your ark in the desert? From the perspective of, what do we need to build as a country or a community in order to help us mitigate or fight climate change? And that's something that I just want the participants to be thinking about, because it's these kind of big or large scale projects that particularly the Public Investment Corporation, who is now, it's headed by the CEO, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, and they've been putting a lot of money into climate mitigation and green jobs and, green bonds. And we'll come to that at a later stage. But just to get you thinking a little bit about, what if you could build your ark in the desert? What would it be? And then moving along, that's only one story from the Quran. The next one is that of Nabi Yusuf. And the story of Nabi Yusuf is a beautiful and interesting one, mainly because the whole story occurs in one surah from start to finish. in the order that it occurred. And that's rare in the Quran itself, because in the story of Nabi Musa and Nabi Nuh is in different places, but the story of Nabi Yusuf is one story in one surah in order. And from that's the miracle of the Quran. But the king, after he put Nabi Yusuf in the jail, he comes to him and takes him out, and he speaks of this dream where he has 7 fat cows, where 7 thin cows are eating them, and 7 green ears of corn and 7 dry ears of corn. And they're trying to understand, what does this actually mean? And Nabi Yusuf, obviously there's a gap in the story here where they have to pull him out of jail and go to the king. But he goes to the king and he speaks of these 7 consecutive years, where there'll be good harvests. And you can see the ayah on the left. And 7 consecutive years will be bad harvest. But he advises them. He tells them, look, in those 7 years, store your resources, store your grain, right? Make sure you're preparing for the bad years. And the ulama of the tafsir, the last ayah where they speak about, then they will become after a year in which the people have rain, and in it they will press wine and oil. And this is a press here on the right that they used to use back in the day. The ulama say this part was given, and Nabi Yusuf spoke to the king about this part to create an idea of optimism. But if you look at 7 years, 7 good years, 7 bad years, in my humble opinion, when I read this and I came across it, and because my background is in hydrology, it's clear to me that this is most probably one of the first documented ideas of El Nino and La Nina, in my humble opinion. And I think really that's most probably where the Quran starts shedding light on processes, climatic processes in particular. Now we can see on the right here is Cairo or Cairo in Egypt. And we know that the Nile is literally the heartbeat of the desert. I mean, if it wasn't for the Nile, there wouldn't be a Cairo or other major cities along that river. And the Nile's been flowing for thousands of years. Now in the story, and this is the last story in the Quran which alludes to aspects of climate change and how it might impact human life, is the story of Nabi Musa, where they Allah Ta'ala sends a flood, but the flood is the trigger for multiple other events to occur. So the flood brings about the locusts and the weevils and the frog and the blood and all these signs. And I sent this book to a scholar of Maqasid Sharia, and he was always trying to tell me, you must emphasize the maqsid, of these ayat and why. And many fuqaha look at it obviously from that fiqh perspective. But I mean, there's obviously signs in here for us to learn from and understand the impact that water can have. And for those of you in the disease field, how that directly impacts vectors for diseases. So these are all signs within the Quran that Allah shows us by means of case studies. So obviously, now, what lessons are there to learn from this? Firstly and foremostly, black swan events, which are events that occur anomalously on a large scale and have major impact. They are the ones that can have the largest impacts. A good example, the story of Nabi Nuh, black swan event. Major flood wiped out everything. Story of Nabi Musa, a flood, and it affected everything, including the grain, right? Which brings us back to Nabi Musa's story. The spin-off effects of the impacts, or direct impacts or indirect impacts, affect our lives in ways we never really thought possible. I mean, who link the flooding to locusts, to disease? It's not something that, and that is why where KAUST is occurring, and KAUST comes into play at the university, where there's interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, and people from different backgrounds coming together to solve big problems. And that's really where we need to be thinking about these things. I mean, anything can happen in these situations where your long-term drought impacts your food security. It impacts your water security. For those reliant on hydrothermal or even geothermal power, it might have an impact on energy security. So planning, organizing, working together, all these things that are being highlighted here on the right are critical. And the lessons that we learn from these stories as case studies, and we need to take from them and obviously use them in the context we find ourselves in. Now, in the Sunnah itself, Nabi Muhammad says in the Hadith of Ibn Majah, don't waste water even if you are at a running stream. Now, if this is not the practice of sustainability, from the Sunnah, then I don't know what is. But the Nabi Muhammad goes further, and he teaches us that as much as you mustn't waste the water, here is a way or a technique to use this specific amount of water for wudu and ghusl. So you use a half a liter of water for wudu and 2 liters of water, up to 2.5 liters of water for ghusl. And this is a hadith in Bukhari. And if we imagine that all of us practice this on a regular basis, I don't think water shortages would really be an issue, right? But within the Sunnah, there was also other practices that they might not seem as sustainability or sustainable practices themselves, but they help lead towards more sustainable practices within the community and at a larger scale. And one of them is where people would congregate at the mosque. And the mosque was the central meeting point for community. And there was a whole bunch of other activities occurring in and around the mosque. Sorry. And this practice of using the mosque as a central gathering place, where decisions for the community were taken by means of shura, has major spin-off effects. And you can see this is one of the major Ottoman mosques here on the right. And in some places of Turkey, these practices are still there with sustainable finances occurring, right? And they finance the operations in and around the mosque. Now, as good Muslims, as people that are vicegerents, Khalifa, we need to create good environmental practices on our own within our homes. A good example is composting, whereby you have food waste and you build a composter in your backyard, or you dig a trench and you bury that and dig sand over it and plant, because it's good nutrients for the soil. Secondly, using our resources more sparingly, not wasting, right? Conserving and protecting our natural environment is obviously another major thing that we need to be aware of. And fundamentally, this is all underlain by education. We cannot act ignorantly. We have to make sure that we know what we're doing and then execute on that. But none of this can be done if there's not sustainable investments or finances. And this brings me to another sunnah of waqf. Now, waqf has been practiced since the time of the Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some ulama argue even before that. And it literally means for you to stop ownership and hand over the assets. Now, that asset is invested and the investment is for eternity. The hadith speaks about sadaqah jariyah. And the return on that investment is used for community-based projects, like a well, for example, over here, boreholes and water-related projects, community gardens, and what's become big in recent times is financing of green mosques, whereby mosques are able to become more environmentally sustainable buildings, and they're able to contribute towards energy and water in the community, etc. Right? But more recently, and I want to raise obviously what's been done in Saudi Arabia here by the Public Investment Forum and some of their other activities like IIF, which has been dubbed the Davos of the desert. We find that green bonds have taken the forefront. Now, in some communities, they use sukuk, which is an Islamic bond. In other places, they use a normal bond. But these green bonds, and the PIF issued one recently, which is approximately $3 billion, and it was 8 times oversubscribed. That's to say they could have raised possibly $24 billion. And they'll be using these green bonds to diversify the energy mix in the kingdom. That means to say moving away from hydrocarbon and into things like solar, energy and geothermal energy. From also a greening perspective, there's what's known as ESG funds, or environmental, social and governance funds. So they look at these different parameters and lump them, and they would rate a company based on those parameters and how well they perform, and then give them an ESG rating. And if the ESG rating in the company is good, then they choose that as part of the unit trust or the fund. So I mentioned these because we have to understand that as much as we want to save the planet, we need to be, that Khalifa that Allah speaks of in the Quran. We also need finances to float these kind of operations and make them sustainable in the long term. Yes, Awqaf and Waqaf is one of them, and it's one that's been used for many years. But some of the newer instruments, like Sukuk, like Sharia compliant unit trusts, also have their advantages, right? And very importantly, and this is an area that I'm very passionate about, we need to communicate these ideas, and I've done 2 texts around communicating science and conservation. They are available online, and inshallah we hope to print a few copies and maybe distribute them as well, because if people aren't aware, then they act in a way that might actually be detrimental. And it's very important that we just make them aware of what's happening around them and inform them with the right kind of information. With that said, I just want to say thank you and shukran very much to obviously firstly the Saudi Youth for Sustainability Forum, and then COUST Sustainability Initiative, who also supported aspects of this, and then my university, which I currently lecture at, which is Nelson Mandela University here in Abega, formerly known as Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and the colleagues at our lab, which is the PORMED lab, which does research mainly into subsurface fluid flow. Shukran for that, and over to you as the moderator, Fatima.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hadir, for your talk. We really enjoyed it. So now we are opening the floor for any questions. So please, if anyone has a question, please write it down on the chat box.
I think maybe I explained everything well enough. I don't know.
Sure.
No, I'm open to questions. Anybody there? I think there seems to be a hand raised there, Fatima. I don't know. Khalid.
Khalid?
Here we go.
Okay, Khalid, you can talk.
I think Khalid, maybe it's an older hand. There.
Okay, we have some questions. First from Hajar. Do you have a resource where I can read more about it? A book maybe, or a website?
Yeah, I can. Let me share the website with you, and then I also, the book you can find on Amazon Kindle. But like I said, inshallah, we're hoping to print copies and look at possibly putting into bookstores. I had a discussion and there was talk of possibly translating as well into Arabic, but we hope to cross that bridge when we get there. But in the interim, it is available on Kindle, yes.
Okay, thank you. From Rasis, how can we get access to the green funds for sustainability projects?
Okay, shukran for that, Rais. So access, it depends on where you live, okay? In certain contexts, I'll use South African context as a good example. And in Saudi, there are also certain organizations and awqaf that do these kind of things. So what you would do is normally a project or an idea, a sustainability project or an idea you'd come up with, or you have one, or you've implemented one, and you need funding to continue it. And normally they need some kind of proposal, and what is your costing, and you approach them. And in many cases, I mean, there's so many of them. Some of them have very strong focuses, so they only fund maybe water projects, or they've only fund seedling projects, for example. But you have to just make sure that obviously you're approaching the right body, or the right waqf, or the right NGO, and chances are they'll be more than willing to work with you on those kind of sustainability projects.
Okay. Also, we have a question. What do you think the role should be of mosques and religious establishment in climate change action?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's a nice one actually, because we working on green mosques, right? As and mosques as centers for helping fight climate change, and obviously helping towards sustainability. And mosques, they don't only act as buildings or central points for, could be collection of compost, or old oil to be used for biodiesel, or for harvesting water using their roofs, for vegetable gardens, for and obviously the imam or the shuyukh, they play a critical role from the perspective of educating the people. So it's quite holistic if you look at it from a perspective of what is the role the mosque should play. But I think in each community the need would vary. Also, the available resources would vary. This is the kind of things we found out when we've worked on green mosque projects. And the role the mosque plays is critical. It's important because it acts as like a central hub, for information, for resources, for acting and execution on these sustainability initiatives.
Okay, we have also a question. How climate change has impacted the life of people in your hometown or community, or your personally?
Yeah, look, we've seen now in recent times the kind of impacts that climate change can have. In a South African context, we're seeing now for the past few years a long-term drought, and it's affected farmers across the region, to the point that drought has been so long. The city that I come from, which is Cape Town, as well as the city I'm currently in, are both at some stage on the borderline of having no water in their taps. So that's the kind of impact that climate change has had on us, particularly here in South Africa. And I mean, you hear so many stories of people being displaced, where they have to leave the farms, or they have to leave their area because of lack of water. But the opposite can also be true, whereby in January of this year, there's an area of the country which is basically similar to a desert, like in Saudi, and there were rivers flowing there, and they were flowing, not just, they were literally flowing rivers, and that's very rare. So there's ends of the spectrum, and they can obviously have good and bad impacts, but it's obviously shifting the way we do things, as human beings.
I would love to ask you one question, Dr. Gaathier. Could you please tell us what made you write this book, and how you came with your background to make such a book, because I know that you came from a scientific community, and we rarely kind of correlate science with religion, we
Yeah,
take them as solos or separate. So could you please
yeah,
walk us through your journey?
yeah.
That would be
Shukran for that. About 12, 13 years ago, my grandfather, Allah Arham, he was extremely sick, and he was a sheikh in the mosque, and he studied the deen. And while he was sick, I spent some time with him, helping him at his bedside, and we'd have some interesting discussions. I mean, he was, by that time he was already in his 90s, and he had a lot of interesting insights and ideas, and he'd talk to me about things, and he'd always encourage us as his grandchildren and children to always study further. And at the time I was busy with a master's degree, but it was sort of on hold. And obviously while sitting with him, I would read, and I read Maurice Bucal's book on science in the Quran and the Bible. I read a little bit on Zakir Naik's work for science in the Quran. And because of my background in environmental science, I thought, well, there must be something that we can look at from a climate change perspective. And I thought to myself, well, obviously some anomalous floods and that kind of things would be the starting point. And then that's what led to obviously looking at the story of Nabi Noah and Nabi Yusuf and Nabi Musa. But the initial idea was actually started around some of the Waqf projects also, coupled with obviously the experience with my grandfather, Allah Yarham. And then I wrote a conference paper for in about 2009, 2010. And it just sort of grew from that point forward, from being just about climate change in the Quran to the fatwa that have been passed around water related to the ahadith around that, the Islamic law, the Sharia, all those things sort of. And then lastly, and just to add value, I thought, well, we must look at the technologies also that help us in terms of mitigating climate change. And I added all those, into the mix, if you will, and tried to give a holistic viewpoint on what Islam, says, as well as what we've learned from the past, from Muslim and Arab societies, in order for us to help us to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Yeah.
interesting. And was that paper targeted to the scientific community or the kind of Muslim, more religious communities, or was it for both?
Actually, that paper was presented at a conference, an Islamic conference, in Kenya at the time, and I mean, it was, like I say, the focus was more on using Waqf and Islamic finance to help mitigate, but using those examples as case studies or background to show that we need to sort of move in this direction. And it was mainly for an Islamic, social science community. And actually that's actually where my interest, as much as you raise now, around science and working in silos, my interest is actually in Waqf and Awqaf, and how we can use it as a tool, because I've been working with NGOs that have been using Waqf in sustainability for many years, and I think that is maybe, I won't say the gap or the missing link, but it's definitely one of the tools we can use in our societies in order to achieve sustainability, or in order to make an impact in the community, or grow things sustainably, or have access to water, diversify our energy mix. And I really think that Waqf and Awqaf and collective funding is one of the possibilities for financing projects of that nature.
Very interesting indeed. Do you see there, for, as you said, like these civil societies and Awqaf and financial funding from such societies, should they be directed in a certain way or certain projects, or how do you see they should be moving forward?
So look, from from a legal perspective in Islam, you're allowed to bequeath up to 1/3 of your assets after you die. That's to say, you can leave 1/3 of your will for awqaf, right? So some of the ulama say, don't specify what your waqf must be used for, because we don't know what the needs might be, in future generations. Others say you're allowed to, but make it flexible. I'll give you an example. In South Africa here, we have a water waqf. So some of the NGOs, they collect money, and the money used is to drill boreholes. So it's only for water. There's a Awqaf South Africa, which is the national organization here. They have a waqf only for seedlings. So you can approach them, they'll give you seedlings or seeds, and you can go ahead and plant. So there has been obviously these different opinions. But I mean, to leave it open-ended and allow people to obviously find the problems that affect their community and then use that finances to solve those kind of problems would most probably be the best recourse or solution to look at. Because the thing is, and if you look into the history of awqaf in general, we're talking now hundreds of years ago, awqaf was used as a tool for social good. Before it became ministries of awqaf, before the laws affected it, before the land was taken and that kind of thing. Rich individuals. There's a good example in Saudi Arabia of Darb Zubaydah, which is a road from Iraq to Mecca. The wife of Harun al-Rashid built it, and along the road she built water wells, and there's hamamat, like public baths, and there's Ain Zubaydah, which is a spring. And to give you an idea of the size or the extent of Darb Zubaydah, when the Ottoman Empire came in and they did maintenance on Darb Zubaydah, it took them about 10 years just to fix it up. So, these kind of big awqaf, they're good and they help the community and they help the people. But in the context we find ourselves in the modern era, we need to be looking at it maybe a little bit more differently. But I think the principles will obviously, stay more or less the same.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Gaathir. And I'll give the floor back to Fatima. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a question from Naif, so please feel free to ask.
Hello, Dr. Gaathier. It's really nice to hear your topics, and it's really interesting to show your slides. My question is about minimizing littering and throwing trash in the street. It's a big hazard, and it's been like in Middle East, it's well known. Like it's that everyone. It's not really like they don't. I'm not. I don't want to say they don't care, but like how we minimize these, like throwing trash and plastic in the street, and maybe minimize it, for any hazard.
That's an interesting question now, because there's a few approaches. In parts of Asia, particularly Singapore, they use fines. So they see you littering, they fine you automatically, right? That's the one possibility. The other possibility, we're finding what's happening in particularly some parts of South Africa, from what I've seen in Africa. The plastic bags is actually one of the major polluters, right? And when you go to the shop, every time you go to the shop, you get a plastic bag. And the thinking is that you come with your own reusable bag. That's another way of looking at it. In Japan, depending on where you are, the waste is divided into classes, and it can become a bit tedious though. But there would be maybe a glass waste bin or collection point, and a plastic one, and you know, so, and in some places in Japan there's 17 classes of waste. So there's 17 small bins in your house. So it's a bit much though. In other places we're finding that I think it's Madagascar or Mauritius, they've just completely banned certain substances or certain plastic substances, you know, that they know have an impact on the environment. They've just banned them. They put it into law and legislation. So there's a few mechanisms, you know, policy, legislation, you know, be it economic ramifications like fines or education is, I think, fundamentally one of the most important things. You know, you have to change habits, I think, and that's the most difficult thing to do because we're human, you know, we don't want to change. It's easy to stay the same. And I think that's where, you know, I mean, like yourself, now, if you obviously, I can see you're very interested in this. If you're passionate about that thing and you act upon it, I firmly believe that you create the example, you know, be it for your friends, your children, your family, whoever. And that has the spin-off effect. So, you know, I mean, us taking responsibility first, I think is the most important thing. And then being a good example for those around us. And hopefully it rubs off.
Thank you so much.
Yes, that was a great question. Question that came to mind, and I would love to ask you, Dr. Gaathier, if you were with the world leaders in COP27, what would your suggestions be?
Oh, I don't know. That's actually it's a very interesting question. Look, there's been a lot of talk. I mean, you guys have been watching what's happening at COP, and you've seen now, and some of you have attended it as well. There's a push, obviously, in relation to fighting the fossil fuels and limiting our use. We have to obviously think about this holistically. It can't just be a case of, you know, reduction of this and improvement of that. And there has to be some kind of balance. And I think personally, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done from the perspective of us trying to understand that, you know, this whole thing around creating environments where people are just chasing after dollars or money or purely for the sake of the money, but not just with purpose, is in itself problematic. That's just my humble opinion, you know. But I think countries working together to find solutions that help everybody, you know, not just the case of, I'll give you an example. South Africa had, I think, almost $30 billion thrown at us. I use the term loosely, for us to now, you know, decarbonize and change from our coal, you know, power plants. And yes, those things are all important, but you can't do these things in isolation. You know, there has to be some kind of collective effort, and countries really need to not just talk about working together, but actually work together on these large scales. That's why I asked the question, you know, what is your arc in the desert? Sorry, Saudi is a good example. I mean, you guys are looking for water security, aspects of energy and food security, because a lot of the, you know, in some places, a lot of food is imported. So how do we look at, you know, decentralizing certain things so that communities can sort of help one another on a local scale and take care of each other? And that's why things like Shura and Awqaf and, you know, using the mosque as a central facility all become very important. And it's been done in the past. There's so many case studies and examples of where communities like that actually thrived. And when they tried to centralize it to the governments, you know, there was failure, there was corruption, there was issues around misadministration. So I think that is one possibility in terms of how do we allow people to govern themselves in such a way that they're able to, you know, work together at a collective scale, but not too large, because now things like transport, logistics, and those are all impacted. I mean, we saw with COVID. Now you can't get something in from outside of the country that you so desperately need. But if you could do it locally in some way, shape, or form, or have a local substitute for it, you can obviously overcome those kind of hurdles.
Thank you so much. That was interesting.
There's one
questions in the chat. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe I can go for Hetty first. Hetty says here, spoken about climate change, wondering what the Quran says about biodiversity and more generally man's relationship with the natural world. Look, there's a lot of talk about just general environmental management and ecology in the Quran in particular, right? And I raised the point earlier, Hetty, you know, about the this inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, you know, where Allah speaks and He says, you know, we are vicegerents, we are caretakers, you know, we've been placed here, you know, to make sure that things are running properly. You know, there's another place where Allah says, and don't cause corruption on the earth, you know, which could relate to pollution and those kind of things. So those relationships are highlighted. They're all there, you know, in the Quran, and it just becomes a case of going into it and looking at it. There's a brilliant academic. His name is Prof. Ozdemir. He's Turkish. His focus is actually ecology and Islam. If you want to go look at some of his work, I forget his name, but I'll put his the spelling of his surname in the box. He's a big professor in Turkey, and he's done a lot of work around ecology and Islam in the environment. So you can go look at what he's done, Hetty, and then, you know, maybe see if that sort of answers your question. And then Hajar says here, from your honest opinion, do you think our world is going into the right direction in terms of sustainability or not? And then also, what is the impact of telling the next generation that they can make a massive positive change instead of telling them they are a disaster? It's an interesting one, Hajar. Look, I think there are pockets, and there are people that will always want to do good. So I think there is a big push. I mean, we have a lab of 10 students. All of them are extremely passionate about the environment, you know, and they're trying to help people, and they're doing talks. And some of our students go to high schools and they speak about, you know, the environment, or they bring students into the lab to educate them. So I think there's a general consensus, in my humble opinion, from what I've seen and in my travels. People want to make a positive change. This generation, you know, is a environmentally aware generation. But on the flip side, there's also this greenwashing occurring by companies where they say, oh, we environmentally friendly, or we this, or we green, or we, you know, and the wordings they use are very deceptive. But if you go read their public reports and you read what they're doing and you read about their activities, you see they're actually not green at all. And that's why ESG funds, you know, some of them, they call it greenwashing. So they deceive you into letting them think they're green so you can buy their product. You know. In the second part of the question, from the perspective of, you know, the impact of telling the next generation, I like to use the hadith of Prophet ﷺ, where he says, you know, if you hear the siren or the bell or ringing for the day of Qiyamah, right, the horn, and you're busy planting a tree, the Muhammad says, plant that tree. Now, if you look at the analysis by the muhaddithin and the scholars, they say there's many ways to look at this. One way could be, if you're doing something good and you're in the process of doing good, it doesn't matter what happens, do that good, right? Execute on it. The other thing is, it could be seen as, if there's something distracting you from doing good, don't look at that thing. You know, and in doing good, you know, Allah will reward you for doing that good, even though it's the last thing. You know, there's a story in the hadith where there was a very bad person, and she climbed into a well to get water for a dog or a cat, and that act alone helped them to enter Jannah. So, you know, these kind of things, we need to just, I really think, Hajar, stay positive, you know, and inshallah, you know, Allah will reward you for the good things you do. you know, instead of us looking just at the negative.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaathier. Thanks for all the amazing answers. Any final questions or thoughts from you and from our audience? Any final message that you would leave us with moving forward?
Shukran for that, Iman. Yes, Fatima, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gaathier, and thank you everyone for your attending. And please, I would like to ask you all to follow us through our social media accounts, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and please share with us your thought about this talk. Thank you, Dr. Gaathier, again.
Thank you
shukran
so much.
to you.
Shukran jazeelan.
Shukran to you, Iman and Fatima, and I really think I mean, it doesn't take a large group of individuals, you know, rather a small group of individuals that are committed to the cause and that are consistently doing good in what they do, and that's how you impact, you know, change, you know, as a collective. And inshallah khair, the work that you're doing at the Saudi Youth for Sustainability, you know, Allah help you all and make it easy and give you strength and patience, you know. And I mean, if there's any other way that we can help from our side, you know, in a form of talks or information or pamphlet sharing or whatever it may be, inshallah khair, you know. Prof Huda says can send the accounts. Just which accounts is that?
The social media accounts, I guess.
Oh, yes.
From what I learned from you, you only have LinkedIn, right? You do not use social media.
I only have LinkedIn, and this is the website, my website. So you can look at the website. All my stuff is on the website. I blog sometimes and links to the books and links to some of the interviews I've done before and some of the work.
And for our thank you so much. And for our social media, you could find them at sys.edu.sa. Thank you so much. I was so delighted to have you with us today, and more things to come, inshallah. Fatima, would you like to say any final words, or Dr. Gaathier, before we say goodbye?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gaathier.
Shukran to you guys for having us. Shukran.
Shukran. Ma salama. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Okay. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.
Ma salam. Ya ma Allah. Ma salam.